6 months from now, at exactly 3:47 in the morning, everything Elena Thorne had been hiding would be revealed in fire and blood. But that moment hadn't come yet. For now, she was just the contract nurse nobody noticed. 6 months earlier, the apartment in Phoenix, Arizona didn't look lived in. It looked like a hotel room someone had occupied for 3 months and never bothered to make their own. Bare walls the color of old teeth, a single bookshelf with trauma medicine textbooks stacked in alphabetical order by author. One photograph on the nightstand, 6 women in full combat gear, standing in the dust of an Afghan village, arms around each other, grinning at the camera with the kind of joy that only comes from surviving something terrible together. Their body armor was tan, their weapons were black. The mountains behind them were the color of dried blood in the late afternoon sun. 5 of them were still alive. Captain Elena Thorne stood in front of that photograph, holding a steel memorial bracelet in her right hand. The metal was warm from her palm. The engraving was worn smooth in places from 4 years of friction against bone and tendon in the machinery of daily life. S.G.T. Kira Brennan, USA, March 14th, 2021, north 31 degrees, 36 minutes, 42 seconds, east 65 degrees, 42 minutes, 18 seconds, Kandahar province. A dirt road that didn't have a name, an IED buried in the shoulder where the hard pack met the gravel. 4 dead, 3 wounded, one survivor who couldn't stop asking why it had been her. Elena slid the bracelet onto her wrist. It clicked against the bone. It always clicked against the bone. She'd been wearing it for 4 years, and the sound still landed somewhere deep in her chest. The same place every time. "Okay, Hawk," she said to the empty room, to the photograph, to a woman who'd been 24 years old and afraid of spiders and could field strip an M4 carbine in 17 seconds flat. One more. She was 28 years old. Blonde hair pulled into a bun so tight it could survive a helicopter ride. Gray-green eyes that people described differently depending on the light. Warm jade when she was laughing. Cold slate when she wasn't. A small scar bisected her left eyebrow. A souvenir from an IED in Helmand province that had gifted her 3 stitches and a headache that lasted 6 weeks. Her hands were calloused. Working hands, not surgeon's hands. She moved with an economy of motion that most people mistook for laziness, until they saw how fast she actually was. Elena Thorne had grown up in Prescott, Arizona, a small, quiet town 90 minutes north of Phoenix, where her father fixed Chevrolets for a living and her mother served lunch to other people's kids at the elementary school. Nobody in her family had been to college. The military wasn't patriotism for Elena. It was a way out. She'd enlisted in the United States Army at 18, basic training at Fort Jackson, advanced individual training as a 68W, combat medic. Then she'd done something that most people thought was impossible. She'd volunteered for Ranger School, 61 days of hell, mountains and swamps and sleep deprivation, and instructors who treated her like a science experiment they were trying to break. She graduated in the bottom third of her class, but she'd graduated, earned the Ranger tab, got assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment as a medic. Then she'd been selected for the Female Engagement Team program, one of the very first programs that attached female soldiers to infantry combat patrols in Iraq and Afghanistan to conduct security searches and engage with local women. One of the very first programs that put American women directly into ground combat, years before the policy officially changed. 4 combat deployments, 183 patrols, 23 firefights. A Bronze Star with Valor for carrying a wounded Ranger 400 meters through an active ambush while suppressing fire with her sidearm. A Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds that left scars she didn't talk about. A dead best friend. She'd gotten out as a captain after 11 years. Used her GI Bill to finish a nursing degree from Arizona State University that she'd been chipping away at during deployments. Spent 2 years working trauma at the Phoenix VA Medical Center. 2 years of fluorescent lights and paperwork, and patients who called her sweetheart in emergency rooms that moved too slowly for hands that still remembered how fast things could go wrong. Then Aegis Medical Solutions had called, a private military medical contracting firm. They needed a trauma nurse for a joint special operations task force training facility. 12 months, hazard pay, a forward operating base in the Nevada desert supporting counterterrorism training operations. She'd said yes before they finished the sentence. The recruiter had paused on the other end of the line, probably surprised by the speed of her answer. Most nurses wanted time to think about it, wanted to talk to their families, wanted to weigh the money against the risk. Elena didn't have a family to consult. Her parents had both passed. Her father from a heart attack at 61, her mother from pancreatic cancer 2 years later. Both of them gone before Elena ever figured out how to explain to them what she'd done in Afghanistan. She had no siblings, no partner, no kids. The apartment in Phoenix was a place she slept, not a place she lived. The truth was she'd been ready to go back the moment she'd come home. Civilian life felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. Technically functional, but wrong in a way she felt with every step. Now she was packing the same olive drab duffel bag she'd been packing since she was 18 years old. The same 3 t-shirts, the same running shoes with 200 miles on them, the same dog-eared copy of the Ranger Handbook that she could still recite from memory. She picked up the photograph from the nightstand, looked at Kira Brennan's face, the wide smile, the dark eyes that had seen too much and still found reasons to laugh. They'd been assigned as FET partners in 2018, 2 women in a world built for men. Kira had looked at her on their first patrol and said, "They're going to underestimate us every day. Let's use it." And they had. For 3 years they'd walked Afghan villages together, sat cross-legged on dirt floors drinking tea with women who'd never spoken to an American soldier before, gathered intelligence that saved lives, built relationships that turned into target packages that took bad people off the battlefield. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March 2021, an IED had turned Kira Brennan into a memory and a set of coordinates and a steel bracelet that clicked against Elena's wristbone every single day. Elena slid the photograph into the front pocket of the duffel bag, zipped it closed, turned off the lights, locked the door, drove to the airport in a truck that had 200,000 miles on it and an OIF veteran sticker she'd never bothered to peel off the bumper. She didn't look back. Forward Operating Base Sentinel sat on a patch of barren scrubland in the high desert where California met Nevada. Officially, it didn't exist. The maps showed nothing. The satellite imagery was conveniently blurred. The local civilians who lived in the towns 40 miles away knew there was something out there, but they didn't ask questions, and the military didn't volunteer answers. It was a Joint Special Operations Command training facility, a place where Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and Delta Force operators came to rehearse missions before they deployed to the places where America fought wars it didn't talk about on the evening news. A place where they practiced kicking down doors and calling in airstrikes and learning how to tell the difference between a farmer and a fighter in the 3 seconds you had to make that decision. And because training sometimes went wrong, because men jumped out of helicopters and rappelled down buildings and shot thousands of rounds in close quarters battle drills, there was a medical facility. The Roll 2 Forward Surgical Facility was Elena's world. 3 connected ISO containers that held 2 trauma bays, 1 operating suite, and 8 recovery beds. Staffed by a Navy trauma surgeon, 2 nurses, 3 Navy corpsmen, and 1 anesthesiologist. Their job was damage control, stabilize and evacuate, not fix and finish. If you were hurt bad enough to land on their tables, you were getting a helicopter ride to Nellis Air Force Base or straight to Germany, depending on how bad it was. Elena had settled into a rhythm during her first week. Night shifts, coffee at midnight, rounds at 0200, paperwork at 0400, handoff at 0600, when the day shift stumbled in looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The young corpsmen rotated through her trauma bay like nervous puppies, eager, well-trained, terrified of screwing up in front of the SEAL operators who treated the medical staff like furniture you didn't make eye contact with. One corpsman stood out. Petty Officer 3rd Class Ethan Price was 21 years old, 3 months into his first deployment. Blonde hair buzzed down to nearly nothing. Blue eyes that were always a little too wide, like he was waiting for someone to tell him he'd made a mistake and he needed to leave. He had good hands and better instincts, but he'd never worked under fire. He reminded Elena of someone, and it took her 2 weeks to figure out who. Herself. At 19, lacing up boots for her first patrol in Helmand Province. That same mixture of raw talent and barely contained terror that you could see in the eyes if you knew what to look for. Elena had started teaching him things. Small things at first. The right way to pack hemostatic gauze so it deployed clean under pressure. How to read a patient's color before the monitors caught up. The difference between a tension pneumothorax and a simple pneumothorax by sound alone. One wheezed, the other didn't. And if you missed it, someone died. "You're leaving the hemostatic gauze on the wrong shelf again," Elena said during a quiet shift, her Arizona drawl stretching the vowels the way it always did when she was tired. Ethan scrambled to fix it. "Sorry, ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am. I work for a living." The phrase came out before she could stop it. The oldest enlisted joke in the military. Officers got called sir or ma'am. Enlisted got called by their rank. It was a way of saying, "I'm one of you, not one of them." Ethan gave her a funny look. She changed the subject. But he'd noticed. And Elena knew he'd noticed. And that was going to be a problem eventually. The problem wasn't Ethan. The problem was Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hendricks. Hendricks was the SEAL platoon leader on the FOB. 38 years old, built like a weapon you'd want on your side in any fight, anywhere on Earth. 16 years in the Navy, 13 as a SEAL. Dark brown hair buzzed tight, a jaw that looked like it had been carved from sandstone. Deep-set brown eyes that tracked everything and gave nothing back. He moved with the coiled, predatory ease of someone who'd kicked in a lot of doors and expected the next one to kick back. He was also, Elena had decided within the first week, the most infuriating man she'd ever met. And she'd met a lot of infuriating men. Hendricks didn't trust contractors. More specifically, Hendricks didn't trust her. He'd made that clear the day she arrived, and he'd been making it clearer every day since. "Let me be clear, Thorne," Hendricks had said during their first medical brief, standing in the middle of the trauma bay like he owned it. "My operators come back hurt. They get treated by my corpsmen, not by some contract nurse who got her trauma experience from a weekend seminar." Elena had looked at him for a long time, the kind of long time that made other people uncomfortable. Then she'd said, in a voice so calm it barely registered as speech, "Your Petty Officer Navarro missed a tension pneumothorax on your last post-op patient. I caught it. Your operator is alive because I was here. You can dislike me, Senior Chief, but you can't argue with the vitals monitor." Hendricks hadn't responded. He just walked out. After he left, Elena stood alone in the trauma bay for a full minute, her hands flat on the stainless steel counter, feeling her pulse in her fingertips. She wasn't angry. Anger was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself somewhere around her second deployment, when she'd learned that the things that made you angry were usually the things you couldn't control. And wasting energy on things you couldn't control was a good way to die in Helmand Province. She was something else, something quieter and deeper than anger. She was tired of being unseen, tired of the casual cruelty of assumptions, that a woman in civilian scrubs couldn't possibly know what she was doing, that hazard pay meant tourist, that the only people who understood combat were the ones currently wearing the uniform. She thought about Kira, about the day they'd been assigned as FET partners. And Kira had looked at her and said, "They're going to underestimate us every day. Let's use it." Elena flexed her hands, turned back to her station, and used it. But it got worse. Hendricks went over her head to the base commander, requesting qualified military medical staff to replace her. He insisted his corpsmen handle all pre-hospital care, cutting Elena out of the loop. He questioned her clinical decisions in front of other personnel. He refused to brief her on upcoming operations. "Need to know," he'd said, "and you don't." Elena understood. She didn't like it, but she understood. Hendricks wasn't evil. He was a devoted leader who'd seen contractors freeze under fire and get people killed. She'd heard the story from Chief Petty Officer Luis Navarro, the SEAL platoon's senior medic. A steady, observant man who'd been quietly impressed by Elena's skills since week one. "He lost a guy named Walsh," Navarro told her one night in the trauma bay, keeping his voice low. "Last deployment, forward aid station, contract medic rolled in. Walsh bled out on the floor while this guy just stood there shaking. Senior Chief's been carrying that ever since." Elena nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just kept showing up, doing her job, absorbing the hostility like she'd been absorbing things her entire life, like an anvil. The weeks passed in a rhythm of heat and dust, and the low-grade tension that lived in every forward operating base on Earth. The constant awareness that something bad was always 30 seconds away. Elena taught. Ethan learned. Hendricks seethed. One night, 3 weeks before the world changed, a SEAL operator came back from a training exercise with a gunshot wound to the upper arm. Through and through, brachial artery intact. But the bleeding was heavy, and the operator was pale from blood loss. Elena stabilized him in 19 minutes. IV access, packed the wound, started a transfusion, prepped him for medevac. Textbook. Hendricks watched from the doorway. When Elena finished, he turned to his corpsman and said, loud enough for the entire trauma bay to hear, "Double-check her work." The corpsman, Navarro, looked at Elena. She shook her head once, barely perceptible. "Don't." Navarro double-checked the work anyway, not because he doubted her, but because Hendricks was his senior chief, and that was how it went. He found nothing wrong. He told Hendricks everything was solid. Hendricks said nothing and left. The operator on the table, a 26-year-old from Nebraska with a wife and a baby daughter back in Virginia Beach, looked up at Elena. "That dude's got a problem with you." "That dude," Elena said, adjusting his IV drip, "is going to have a problem with anyone who isn't one of his guys. It's not personal." "Feels personal." Elena almost smiled. "It always does. Try not to move your arm. I just packed that wound, and I don't want to repack it because you wanted to scratch your nose." The operator laughed, then winced, then laughed again. She was good at that, at putting people at ease while she worked on them, at making the terrible seem manageable through the sheer force of calm competence. It was a skill she developed not in nursing school, but on her knees in Afghan dust, holding together soldiers who were terrified and bleeding, and needed someone to tell them it was going to be okay, even when it probably wasn't. Elena watched Hendricks go, then turned back to the patient. Her hands were steady, her face was blank, but something behind her eyes had gone very still and very quiet, the way a lake goes still before a storm rolls in. Later that night, she sat outside the trauma bay on an overturned ammo crate, staring at the high desert sky. The stars were impossible out here. No light pollution for 100 miles in any direction. Just the Milky Way sprawled across the darkness like a river of crushed diamonds. The air smelled like dust and diesel and the sharp, medicinal tang of the surgical suite behind her. She touched the bracelet on her right wrist. "I found another one, Hawk," she said quietly. To nobody, to the stars, to a dead woman buried in Arlington National Cemetery who had been 24 years old and afraid of spiders, and could field strip an M4 faster than anyone in their platoon. Young, scared, good hands. I'm going to keep him alive, I promise. She remembered the day she'd held Kira in that ditch outside Kandahar. The weight, the blood, the way Kira's eyes stayed focused on hers until the very end. Kira had made Elena promise two things. Tell my mom I wasn't scared, and keep teaching them. Elena had kept both promises for 4 years. The generator hummed. Somewhere on the FOB, someone was playing country music badly on a guitar. A dog, one of the strays that lived around the perimeter, barked once and went quiet. Elena closed her eyes. She'd been having the dream again. The one where she was back in Kandahar, walking a dirt road with Kira beside her. And Kira was telling her something important, but Elena couldn't hear the words. And then the road wasn't there anymore. Just the sound, just the pressure, just the feeling of holding someone who was already gone and not being able to let go. Because if she let go, it meant it was real. She opened her eyes. Staff Sergeant Cole Barrett was standing 10 feet away watching her. He was a Marine, one of the embassy's security group Marines assigned to FOB Sentinel security detail. The only other Marine on the entire base, 35 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet in the way that Marines who'd seen things got quiet. He'd been watching Elena for weeks with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself. The look of someone who sees something familiar in a stranger and can't quite place it. Can't sleep? Elena asked. Perimeter check, Barrett said. He paused. You do that thing again. What thing? The scanning thing. Every time you walk across the FOB, you check your corners. You count exits. You keep your back to walls. He tilted his head. Contract nurses don't do that. Elena held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she said, Good night, Staff Sergeant, and went back inside. Barrett stood there a moment longer. Then he walked to the armory, signed out an M9 sidearm, and placed it in the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet in the trauma bay. They never discussed it. The intelligence reports were getting worse. Increased surveillance activity around the FOB, unusual foot traffic in the wadis, the dry riverbeds that snaked through the scrubland and provided concealment for anyone who wanted to approach unseen. The daily threat brief posted outside the Tactical Operations Center used words like elevated and credible and imminent, the kind of words that made experienced people pay very close attention. Elena read the threat brief every morning. Nobody noticed because contract nurses weren't supposed to care about that. She started sleeping in the trauma bay. Ethan noticed. You okay, Thorne? You've been sleeping here all week. Closer to the coffee, she said. He laughed. She didn't. 3 nights before the attack, Elena was walking back from the latrine when a generator backfired. A sharp, percussive bang that split the silence. She dropped low. Her hand reached for a sidearm she wasn't carrying. Her body was already rotating toward the sound with the instinctive precision of someone who'd heard that sound 1,000 times. And it had meant something very different. She caught herself in half a second, stood up, brushed the dust off her scrubs. Behind her, Navarro was standing in the shadows, a bottle of water in his hand. He'd seen the whole thing. Their eyes met. Navarro didn't say a word, but the next morning he went to Hendricks and said something he'd never said before. Senior Chief, you need to ease up on Thorne. I don't know where she learned what she knows, but she's better than half the corpsmen I've trained. She's not the problem. Hendricks looked at him. She's a civilian. Yeah, Navarro said. Maybe. The night before the attack, Elena did something she almost never did. She sat with Ethan in the trauma bay during a quiet shift and told him a story. Not the whole story. Not yet. Just a piece of it. I had a friend once, she said, turning a suture packet over in her hands. She was younger than you. Best hands I ever saw in anyone. Ethan stopped sorting IV bags. Something in her voice made the hair on his neck stand up. What happened to her? Elena was quiet for a long time. The fluorescent lights buzzed above them. Outside, the wind pushed sand against the container walls with a sound like whispered static. She taught me that the most important thing you can do in this job isn't the procedure. It's the presence. You being there. Your voice telling them they're not alone. She paused. She taught me that, and then she was gone. Ethan set down the IV bag. The point is, she said, and her voice was steady again, the way a river is steady over sharp rocks. You have good hands, Ethan, and I'm going to make sure you know how to use them, because someone did that for me once. He looked at her, really looked at her. The way you look at someone when you realize they're not quite who you thought they were. How do you stay so calm? He asked. Doesn't it ever get to you? Every single time, Elena said. I just got good at being scared quietly. You will too. Were you always a nurse? The pause lasted 3 heartbeats. Then she deflected the way she always did. I was a lot of things. Right now I'm your instructor, and you're still leaving the hemostatic gauze on the wrong shelf. 3rd shelf, left side. We've been over this. Ethan smiled and went back to sorting. Elena stared at the wall. The wall of the ISO container was corrugated steel, dented in places, patched in others. Someone had taped a photo of a golden retriever to it. One of the corpsman's dogs back home. A big, goofy animal named Biscuit, who was apparently excellent at destroying furniture. Elena looked at that photo of that stupid, happy dog and felt something tight in her chest release half a turn, the way a valve releases pressure. She didn't know who she'd be without this, without the teaching, the passing on, the quiet act of making someone else better. It was the only thing that made sense anymore. Not the fighting, not the medals, not the deployment pay. This. 2 hands teaching 2 other hands in a metal box in the middle of nowhere, and calling it enough. Commander Rachel Holloway found her an hour later, standing outside the trauma bay in the darkness. Holloway was the Navy trauma surgeon running the role too, 44 years old, calm, experienced, and one of the only people on the FOB who knew the truth about Elena Thorne. Holloway had read her full contractor file the day she arrived. She knew about the Ranger tab. She knew about the Bronze Star. She knew about the 183 combat patrols and the dead FET partner and the 4 deployments to Helmand and Kandahar. She also knew that Elena hadn't told anyone, and she respected that. You've been reading the threat briefs, Holloway said. It wasn't a question. Surveillance activity is increasing, Elena said. The wadis to the south. There's been foot traffic at night, and the pattern is closing in. Each contact report is 200 or 300 meters closer to the wire than the last one. Holloway studied her. The threat assessment says low to moderate. The threat assessment is wrong. Elena's voice was flat, certain. The voice of someone who had walked roads in Afghanistan that looked safe until they weren't. They're probing the perimeter, testing response times, mapping our patterns. Whoever wrote that assessment hasn't been on the ground at a FOB that was about to get hit. And you have? Elena said nothing. Her eyes were on the horizon, the dark line where the scrubland met the sky, visible only because the stars stopped. Holloway nodded slowly. What do you need? I need the trauma bay stage for mass casualty, extra blood products, extra hemostatic agents, airways and chest seals staged at every bed. And I need Ethan to run a combat trauma drill tomorrow night, because that kid has never worked under fire, and if something happens, he needs the muscle memory or he'll freeze. I'll authorize it. One more thing. Elena hesitated. Barrett left a sidearm in my supply cabinet. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. I didn't hear that. Yes, ma'am. And Thorne, Holloway's voice softened. If it comes to it, I'll be in the OR. The trauma bay is yours. Elena nodded. She understood what Holloway was really saying. I know who you are. I trust you. Do what you need to do. She went back inside and started staging the trauma bay for a fight she hoped would never come. There was one more person who'd been watching Elena Thorne with interest. Colonel Garrett Dalton was 62 years old, retired Marine, Gulf War veteran, Silver Star from the Battle of Khafji, a man who'd seen enough combat to recognize it in other people, even when they were trying to hide it. He was technically a civilian contractor now, senior medical advisor to the Joint Special Operations Command training facility. His job was to observe, to consult, to teach when asked. Mostly, he stayed out of the way. But he'd been watching Elena since the day she arrived, watching the way she moved, the way she checked her corners, the way her eyes tracked movement patterns across the FOB with the unconscious precision of someone who'd spent years learning to read terrain for threats. He'd approached her in the trauma bay 3 weeks into her deployment, quiet, respectful, the way one professional approaches another. "You've got the look," he'd said. Elena had turned, studied him, taken in the weathered face, the Gulf War ribbons on his contractor ID badge, the way he stood with his weight slightly forward, always ready to move. "What look is that, sir?" "The one you get from holding dying friends," Dalton said. "Saw it in Kafji in '91. Saw it in Fallujah in '04. Seeing it now." Elena had been quiet for a long moment. "Just a medic, sir." "Bullshit." But he'd said it gently. "I can see it in your eyes. You've been downrange. Real downrange. Not the kind where you sit in an air-conditioned TOC and call it a deployment." He'd paused. "I lost my son, Marine captain, Fallujah, 2004. Preventable bleeding. Medic on scene didn't have the training, didn't have the confidence. My boy died because someone froze." He'd looked at her directly. "I teach what I learned in the Gulf so kids don't die the way mine did. You look like someone who understands that. If you ever want to talk tactics, my door's open." And then he'd walked away. No pressure, no demands, just an offer. Elena had thought about it for 2 days. Then she'd found him in the medical supply office, going through inventory logs. "Colonel," she'd said, "that offer still stand?" Dalton had looked up, smiled. "Thought you'd never ask." And so, quietly, in the margins of the night shifts, in the quiet hours when the base was asleep, Garrett Dalton began teaching Elena Thorne the lessons he'd learned in 30 years of keeping people alive in combat. He taught her the tourniquet application he'd perfected under Scud missile attacks in the Kuwaiti desert in 1991. The field triage protocols he'd developed when medevac was 45 minutes out and you had 6 casualties and 2 hands. The combat mindset that separated freezing from functioning. "Slow is smooth, smooth is fast," he told her one night, demonstrating on a training dummy. His hands shook a little. Age, arthritis, the accumulated damage of 3 decades, but his technique was flawless. Elena watched carefully. "Colonel, your hands..." "Hands shake," Dalton interrupted. "Knowledge doesn't. That's why I teach." He'd shown her something else too, the mental trick he'd learned in Kafji, how to compartmentalize, how to be in the fight and above the fight at the same time, how to let your body do the work while your mind stayed calm. "You already know this," he'd said. "I can see it. You've done it before. I'm just giving you the words for it." And he'd been right. Elena had done it before. In Helmand, in Kandahar, on that dirt road where Kira had bled out in her arms, and Elena had kept working, kept trying, kept her voice calm while her heart was screaming. But having the words for it helped. Having someone who understood helped. Dalton never asked about her past, never pushed. He treated her like a peer, not a student, like someone who already knew the answers and just needed someone to confirm she wasn't crazy. And slowly, Elena began to trust him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked him one night, 3 weeks before the attack. Dalton had been quiet for a long moment. "Because you remind me of my son," he said finally. "Same eyes, same drive to save everyone. I didn't get to teach Logan what I knew. I was too busy fighting my own wars. Didn't make time. He deployed to Fallujah without the skills he needed, and he died because of it." He'd looked at her directly. "That's my regret, so I teach you, and you teach Ethan. And maybe that's how Logan stays alive, through what we pass on." Elena had understood, because that's exactly what she was doing with Kira, keeping her alive through teaching, through passing on the lessons, through making sure that the next kid had the skills that Kira would have taught if she'd lived long enough. "I'm going to train Ethan," she'd said. Run him through combat trauma scenarios. He's never worked under fire. If it comes, he'll freeze without muscle memory. Smart, Dalton had said. Want me to help? I've got it, Elena said. But thank you. Because this was her fight, her responsibility, her trauma bay. Dalton had nodded, understood completely. If it comes, he'd said quietly, I'll be here, but this is your show, Captain, your bay, your call. And Elena had felt something shift inside her chest, the weight of recognition, of being seen, not as a contractor, not as a woman in a man's world, but as a professional, a peer, someone who knew her trade and could be trusted to do it. It was the first time in 6 months someone had called her captain. The night before the attack, Elena ran the combat trauma drill. She'd gotten Holloway's authorization, set up the trauma bay like a training scenario, used the crash test dummies, simulated casualties, had Ethan run through triage protocols under time pressure while she shouted simulated gunfire sounds and threw equipment to create chaos. Ethan had struggled at first, froze when the pressure mounted, forgot his training, grabbed the wrong supplies. Elena had stopped the drill, made him breathe, reset. Ethan, she'd said quietly, look at me. Not at the dummy, at me. He'd looked. You know this, she'd said. We've practiced this 100 times. The chaos doesn't matter. The noise doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the patient in front of you and the technique in your hands. Everything else is just background. What if I freeze? Then you'll freeze, but you'll come back, because I'll be there and I'll bring you back. She'd paused. That's what my friend did for me. First time under fire, I froze, completely blanked, and she grabbed my hands and put them on the wound and said, you know this. Do it now. And I did. Ethan had nodded, breathed, run the drill again. This time he'd moved with confidence, controlled, focused. The muscle memory kicked in. Elena had watched and felt something she hadn't felt in 4 years. Pride. Afterward, she'd found Dalton outside the trauma bay, smoking a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have. He's ready, Elena said. You're ready, Dalton corrected. He's just following your lead. If it comes, it's coming, Dalton interrupted. I've been reading the same threat briefs you have. The pattern's closing in, probably tonight or tomorrow. He'd taken a drag, exhaled slowly. Your trauma bay, your fight. I'll hold the OR with Holloway. You hold the line out here. Colonel, I've been holding lines since before your parents met, Captain. I know what I'm doing, and so do you. He looked at her directly. Trust yourself. You've earned it. Elena had gone back inside, retrieved the M9 from the supply cabinet, checked the magazine, racked the slide, set it on the counter within arm's reach. She'd staged extra blood products, extra hemostatic agents, airways and chest seals at every bed, moved the drug cart to provide cover for the OR entrance, positioned equipment behind the reinforced supply crates. Everything the way she'd learned to do it in Helmand, in Kandahar, on forward operating bases that got hit and survived because someone had taken the time to prepare. She'd sat down at her desk, looked at the trauma base she'd transformed into a fortress, touched Kira's bracelet. We're ready, Hawk, she'd whispered. Whatever comes, we're ready. Outside, the desert night was quiet. Stars burned overhead. The wind carried sand across the empty spaces between the buildings. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire, men were moving, mapping, planning, getting ready to kill Americans and film it for propaganda. They didn't know that the contract nurse in the trauma bay had walked 183 combat patrols, had earned a Bronze Star with valor, had carried a wounded ranger 400 meters through hell and brought him home alive. They didn't know that she'd been waiting for this. That part of her, the part that had never really left Afghanistan, had been ready for this since the moment she'd arrived. At 3:47 in the morning, they were going to find out. The vehicle-borne improvised explosive device hit the south wall at exactly 3:47 in the morning. 400 pounds of homemade explosives, fertilizer, diesel fuel, ball bearings, scrap metal, all of it packed into a Toyota Hilux that had been stolen from a construction site 40 miles away. Driven by a man who'd been promised martyrdom and 72 virgins and the gratitude of God. What he got was physics. The HESCO barriers, wire mesh containers filled with sand and gravel, absorbed some of the blast, deflected the shrapnel upward and outward, saved lives by simple geometry. But the explosion was massive enough that it didn't matter. The south wall ceased to exist as a functional barrier. A section 20 meters wide simply disappeared in a column of fire and dust and superheated air that rolled across the base like a physical thing. The trauma bay shook hard enough that equipment fell off shelves. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The lights died. For exactly 2 seconds, there was total darkness and a ringing silence that felt like the end of the world. Then the emergency generator kicked in. Red lights bathed everything in the color of old blood. Outside, chaos erupted. Automatic weapons fire tore through the darkness. The distinctive clatter of AK-47 Kalashnikov actions, firing in short, controlled bursts. Return fire came immediately. The deeper, steadier boom of American M240 machine guns and the sharp crack of M4 carbines. The base alarm started screaming, a continuous wail that made rational thought almost impossible. Men were shouting. Someone was calling for a corpsman. Someone else was calling for more ammunition. The Tactical Operations Center was broadcasting on every radio frequency. Attack, attack, attack! South perimeter breach. All personnel to fighting positions. Inside the trauma bay, Elena Thorne was already moving. Ethan Price, standing near the supply cabinet, watched her transform. There was no transition, no moment of panic or hesitation. 1 second she was the quiet contract nurse who drank too much coffee and corrected his hemostatic gauze placement. The next second, she was someone else entirely. Her posture changed, shoulders back, weight forward on the balls of her feet. Her eyes went flat and cold, the warm green disappearing into something harder, something that had been forged in places where hesitation meant death. When she spoke, her voice was low and absolutely controlled. The kind of voice that went under panic and found the part of the brain that still worked when everything else was shutting down. Ethan. She didn't shout, didn't need to. Triage protocol, now. Move the post-op patient behind the supply crate. He's ambulatory. Walk him there. Go. Ethan went. His body moved before his brain caught up. Muscle memory from the drill they'd run the night before. The post-op patient, a SEAL operator recovering from a training injury, was already sitting up, eyes wide, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. "Sir, this way," Ethan said, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. "Behind the supply crate, come on." The operator moved. Ethan positioned him in cover, then turned back. Elena was transforming the trauma bay into a fortress. She moved with a speed and economy that was almost supernatural. Equipment that could become projectiles went behind the reinforced supply crates. The drug cart got repositioned to provide cover for the operating suite entrance, where Commander Holloway was already scrubbing in, her face set in concentration. Medical supplies that would be needed immediately went to arm's reach. Everything else got secured. She pulled open the bottom drawer of the supply cabinet, removed the M9 sidearm that Barrett had left there, checked the magazine with a practiced motion, 15 rounds, 1 in the chamber, racked the slide, set it on the counter within easy reach. She did all of this in less than 45 seconds. Then the wounded started coming. The first was a SEAL operator with shrapnel wounds. Fragments of the HESCO barrier that the VBIED had turned into high-velocity projectiles had torn through his face, his arms, his chest. He stumbled through the trauma bay door, half carried by another operator who was shouting something about the south wall being gone. "The whole south wall. They're coming through. 8, maybe 12 dismounts, heading this way." Set him here, Elena said, pointing to the first trauma bed. Her voice was calm, professional, like she was discussing the weather. Ethan, primary survey, March protocol. Start with massive hemorrhage. I see arterial spray on the left arm. Tourniquet above the wound. You know this. Go. Ethan's hands were shaking. He looked at the blood on the floor, on the operator's face, on his own scrubs where he'd helped carry the casualty. And for one terrible second, his mind went completely white. A blank wall where his training used to be. All the drills, all the practice, all the knowledge, gone. Just static and the sound of his own heartbeat and the distant rattle of automatic weapons fire. Ethan, Elena's voice, low, controlled, coming from somewhere very close. Look at me, not at the blood, at me. He looked. Her eyes were steady. Her hands were already working on a second operator who'd come through the door with a penetrating wound to the abdomen. Blood was pooling on the floor beneath him. You know this, she said. We practiced this. Last night, remember? Clamp, pack, hold, do it now. His hand stopped shaking. He reached for the tourniquet, applied it high and tight above the arterial spray, just like she'd taught him. Twisted the windlass. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. He clamped the exposed vessel, packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, applied pressure. The operator was still bleeding from facial lacerations, but the life-threatening hemorrhage was controlled. Good, Elena said, not looking up from her own patient. Now check for pneumothorax. Listen to lung sounds. You know the difference. One wheezed, the other didn't. Ethan listened. Equal breath, sounds bilaterally. No tension pneumothorax. No immediate airway compromise. He's stable for now, Ethan said, and his voice was steady, controlled, like hers. Then move to the next one, Elena said. They're going to keep coming. Don't stop moving. She was right. Two more operators came through the door. One was walking, supporting his own weight despite a through-and-through gunshot wound to the thigh. The other was being dragged by Chief Petty Officer Luis Navarro, and Navarro was limping badly, his left thigh dark and wet with blood. Elena assessed in a glance. The walking wounded could wait. Navarro's leg was arterial. The man he was dragging had a penetrating chest wound and was struggling to breathe. Navarro had been hit outside the Tactical Operations Center and had still managed to carry his wounded teammate 40 meters to the medical facility. He collapsed against the wall, breathing hard, face gray with pain and blood loss. Ethan, take Navarro, Elena said, her hands already moving to the chest wound patient. Tourniquet high and tight on the left thigh. He's going to tell you it's fine. It's not fine. Ignore everything he says and stop the bleeding. I'm fine, Navarro grunted from the floor. See? Elena said, not looking up. Ignore him. Ethan moved to Navarro, applied the tourniquet. Navarro gritted his teeth, but didn't make a sound. The bleeding slowed. Ethan packed the wound, applied a pressure bandage, started an IV line. Elena was working on the chest wound. Penetrating trauma, right side, third intercostal space. The operator's breathing was rapid and shallow. His oxygen saturation was dropping. His trachea was deviating to the left. Tension pneumothorax. Air was leaking from the damaged lung into the chest cavity, building pressure, collapsing the lung, shifting the mediastinum, compressing the heart. If she didn't decompress it in the next 60 seconds, the patient would go into cardiac arrest. Ethan, she said, her voice still calm, still controlled. I need you to hold this patient's arm out of the way. I'm doing a needle decompression. Ethan moved, held the arm, watched Elena select a 14-gauge catheter, palpate the landmarks, insert the needle into the second intercostal space at the mid-clavicular line. There was a hiss of escaping air. The patient's breathing immediately improved. His oxygen saturation started climbing. Chest seal, Elena said. Ethan handed it to her. She applied it, secured it, moved to the next task without pause. The trauma bay was organized chaos. 4 patients, all critical. 2 corpsmen, Ethan, and 1 other who'd appeared from somewhere, working under Elena's direction. Holloway in the operating suite with the anesthesiologist, already working on the most critical abdominal trauma. And outside, the gunfire was getting closer. Staff Sergeant Cole Barrett appeared in the doorway. He was in full combat gear, body armor, helmet, rifle. His face was streaked with dust and sweat. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been in firefights before and knew exactly how bad this one was. "Thorne," he said, "they're pushing through the south perimeter. 8 to 12 dismounts, maybe more. They're heading for the medical facility." The words hung in the air like a physical weight. The medical facility was the softest target on the base, a building full of wounded people and medical staff, not hardened operators with rifles and training. If the attackers reached it, everyone inside was dead. The wounded would be executed. The staff would be killed or taken hostage. It would be filmed, posted online, used as propaganda. Elena looked at Barrett, then at the trauma bay. 4 critical patients, Ethan working on Navarro, the other corpsman managing airways. Holloway in the OR, elbow deep in someone's abdominal cavity. She made a decision that took less than 2 seconds. "Barrett," she said, "give me that rifle." Barrett unslung the M4 from his back, held it out. No hesitation, no questions, just recognition. One warrior to another. From the operating suite entrance, Colonel Garrett Dalton's voice cut through the chaos. "Ghost, you're needed here." "Ethan can handle triage," Elena said, already taking the rifle. "Holloway's got surgery. I'm the only one here who's done this before." She caught the M4 one-handed, conducted a functions check with movements so practiced they were almost unconscious. Tapped the magazine, racked the charging handle, checked the chamber, assessed the safety selector, chamber round, ready to fire. 2 seconds. The muscle memory of 183 combat patrols. Ethan was staring at her. His tourniquet was in place. Navarro's bleeding was controlled. But his eyes were on Elena and the rifle, and his face was the face of someone watching a stranger step out of a person they thought they knew. "Stay with the patients," Elena told him. "No matter what you hear out there, stay. You understand me?" Yes, I understand. You've got this. You're ready. Trust your training." She turned toward the door, toward the gunfire, toward the darkness beyond the red emergency lights. Stopped being a nurse, became what she'd been before. What happened over the next 23 minutes would be reconstructed from multiple sources during the after-action review. From Barrett's combat report, from the SEAL operator's statements, from the Tactical Operations Center's radio logs, and the helmet camera footage that captured fragments of the engagement, and from Ethan Price, who could see pieces of it through the trauma bay window and would never forget any of it. Elena Thorne fought like someone who'd been doing it her entire adult life, not like a nurse who'd picked up a rifle, like a ranger who'd put on scrubs for a while and just picked the rifle back up. She moved with Barrett from the trauma bay entrance to a sandbagged fighting position 15 meters south, using fire and maneuver, the foundational tactic of infantry combat. One person moves while the other provides covering fire. Leapfrog forward or back. Never stop moving. Never give the enemy a stationary target. They established a sector of fire covering the approach to the medical facility. The south wall was gone. The HESCO barriers were scattered debris. Beyond them, in the darkness lit intermittently by muzzle flashes in the burning wreckage of the VBIED, figures were moving. 8 dismounts, maybe more. Al-Shabaab splinter cell, the intelligence report would later confirm. They'd been surveilling the base for weeks, mapping patrol patterns, counting personnel, waiting for the right moment. They'd chosen tonight because the moon was down and a sandstorm 2 days earlier had degraded the surveillance cameras. They'd hit the south wall because it was the furthest from the main barracks and the closest to the medical facility. They wanted to kill wounded Americans, film it, post it online, Show the world that American blood could still be spilled. What they hadn't expected was Elena. "Contact," she called out, her voice carrying across the firefight with practiced clarity. 2 o'clock, 75 meters, two dismounts behind the HESCO debris. Barrett shifted his fire sector. Didn't question, didn't hesitate, trusted her completely. Elena engaged targets with controlled pairs. 2 rounds, center mass. Reassess. Acquire next target. 2 rounds. Reassess. The disciplined, economical shooting of someone who'd been trained to make every bullet count because ammunition was finite and the fight was always longer than you expected. The M4 kicked against her shoulder. Brass ejected into the darkness. The suppressor kept her muzzle flash minimal. But even in the dark, she knew where her rounds were going. She'd done this before. In Helmand, in Kandahar, on night patrols where the only light was starlight and the thermal bloom of human bodies at 300 meters. The attackers had expected to advance unopposed to the medical facility. Instead, they were taking accurate fire from a defensive position they hadn't mapped. They went to ground, tried to flank. Elena called it before they completed the maneuver. "Barrett, they're moving left, 50 meters. 3 dismounts trying to use the wadi for concealment." Barrett engaged. The 3 dismounts stopped moving. The quick reaction force was spinning up at Nellis Air Force Base, 70 miles away. Black Hawk helicopters with door gunners and a ground element. But they needed 12 to 15 minutes to arrive. Elena and Barrett needed to hold the line until then, which meant Elena needed to transition. She fell back to the trauma bay, not retreating, transitioning. Because inside there were people dying, and she was the only one who could keep them alive long enough for the medevac to arrive. A SEAL operator had been brought in while she was fighting. Shrapnel to the throat. His airway was compromised. He was struggling to breathe, his oxygen saturation dropping into the 70s. Ethan was trying to manage it with a bag valve mask, but it wasn't working. The operator needed a surgical airway. Elena set the rifle against the wall, pulled on gloves, selected a scalpel and a bougie and a 6.0 endotracheal tube from the airway kit. "Ethan, hold his head steady. I'm doing a cricothyrotomy." Outside, the gunfire continued. Rounds impacted the container walls with sharp metallic pings. Dust fell from the ceiling. The red emergency lights flickered. Elena palpated the landmarks on the operator's throat, found the cricothyroid membrane, made the incision. The scalpel cut clean through skin and fascia. Her hands moved with the supernatural steadiness of muscle memory. She'd done this before. In Helmand, under fire, with Kira guiding her through it the first time. "Trust your hands, Ghost," Kira's voice in her memory. Elena's hands didn't shake. She inserted the bougie through the incision, slid the endotracheal tube over it, removed the bougie, inflated the cuff, attached the bag valve mask. The operator's oxygen saturation started climbing. 75, 80, 85. "Good," Elena said. "Ethan, you've got this. Bag him. 12 breaths per minute. I've got to go back out." "You're going back out there?" "They're still coming," Elena said. "And we're the only thing between them and the wounded." She picked up the rifle, checked the magazine, 23 rounds remaining. She grabbed 2 spare magazines from Barrett's gear, slid them into her pockets, and moved back to the door. Dalton was standing at the entrance to the operating suite, watching her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held something that looked like recognition and respect. "Your bay, Captain," he said quietly. "Your fight." Elena nodded once, moved back into the darkness. The next transition came 8 minutes later. Navarro's gunshot wound needed proper treatment. The tourniquet had stopped the bleeding, but if it stayed on too long, he'd lose the leg. Elena needed to remove it, pack the wound with hemostatic gauze, apply a pressure bandage, and re-establish blood flow before tissue damage became irreversible. She fell back to the trauma bay again. Barrett held the line alone, firing controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, waiting for her to return. Elena worked on Navarro with one ear on the gunfire outside. Remove the tourniquet. Blood welled immediately. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, layer after layer, applying pressure with her palm. The gauze activated on contact with blood, promoting clotting at the chemical level. While she worked, Ethan was managing an arterial bleed on the shrapnel patient. His hands were steady now. He'd found his rhythm. The panic from the beginning was gone, replaced by focused concentration. Elena watched him work while her hands managed Navarro's wound, saw the way he checked his work, the way he talked to the patient, keeping him calm, the way he moved with purpose instead of panic. Keep pressure here, she told him, positioning his hands on the shrapnel patient's wound. Don't let go for anything. You hear that shooting outside? It doesn't exist. This wound exists. You and this wound. That's your whole universe right now. Ethan nodded, his jaw set. He pressed down. Elena finished with Navarro, applied the pressure bandage, rechecked circulation distal to the wound. The leg was viable. He'd keep it. You're good, Chief, she told Navarro. Stay down. Don't move. She picked up the rifle, moved back to the door. Navarro called after her. Thorne! She turned. Who the hell are you? Elena looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, someone who's done this before, and went back to the fight. The situation was deteriorating. The attackers had regrouped. They'd taken casualties, but they were still pushing toward the medical facility. They'd split into two elements. One was pinning down Barrett and Elena with suppressive fire. The other was trying to flank through the wadi to the east. Elena saw the maneuver developing, called it on instinct. Barrett, they're flanking east. 4 dismounts in the wadi. I'm shifting position. She moved before he could respond. Fire and maneuver, using cover, keeping low. The rifle was an extension of her body, the same way it had been on 183 patrols. She reached a position that gave her a sight line into the wadi. 4 dismounts, exactly where she'd predicted, moving in single file, using the depression for concealment. They were good, disciplined, well-trained. But Elena had done this in places where the enemy was better. Taliban fighters who'd been at war their entire lives, who knew the terrain better than she did, who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. These guys were dangerous, but they weren't that. She engaged, controlled pairs, leading the targets by half a body length to account for their movement. The first dismount went down. The second spun and tried to return fire. Barrett engaged from his position, catching him in a crossfire. The third and fourth went to ground, and then the Tactical Operations Center needed coordination. The quick reaction force was 5 minutes out. The base defense was holding, but ammunition was running low. Casualties were mounting. The medevac needed a landing zone cleared and secured. Someone needed to coordinate all of it. Elena made another decision. She keyed the radio handset that Barrett had clipped to his vest. The tactical frequency was chaos. Multiple stations talking over each other, situation reports, requests for ammunition, calls for corpsmen, and then a new voice cut through. Clear, professional, absolutely controlled. TOC, this is Ghost. I need fire suppression on the south approach and medevac wheels up in 12 mics. I have 4 urgent surgical and 2 expectant at the roll 2. South perimeter still compromised. Recommend QRF establish security on landing zone before medevac insertion. How copy? 3 seconds of silence. The kind of silence that falls when a room full of professionals hears something they didn't expect and has to recalibrate everything they thought they knew. Then the Tactical Operations Center responded. Station calling. Identify yourself. Barrett, crouched behind cover 6 meters away, keyed his own radio. TOC, this is Barrett. Unknown station is valid. Recommend you listen. Another pause. Unknown station, identify yourself. Full designation. Elena keyed the handset again. And in that moment, the careful civilian mask she'd worn for 6 months, the quiet, competent contract nurse who didn't eat with the operators and didn't talk about her past, cracked and fell away completely. What came through the radio was the voice of a woman who had walked 183 patrols through the most dangerous terrain on Earth and lived to walk 184. TOC, this is Ghost, Captain Elena Thorne, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment. I have 4 urgent surgical and 2 expectant at the roll 2. I need fire suppression on South Approach and medevac wheels up in 12 mics. South Landing Zone needs QRF security before medevac insertion. How copy? The silence lasted 5 full seconds this time. Then the Tactical Operations Center responded, and the voice on the other end belonged to someone who just had their entire understanding of the situation rewritten. Copy all, Ghost. Fire suppression en route. Medevac wheels up now. QRF will secure LZ. Break. All stations be advised, Captain Thorne is validated. Follow her instructions. TOC out. In the Tactical Operations Center, a SEAL communications operator looked at his chief. Who the hell is Ghost? Nobody answered, because nobody knew yet. But Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hendricks, standing in the back of the TOC after fighting on the West Perimeter, had heard the call, had heard the voice, had heard the professional, controlled tone of someone who'd done this before. The contract nurse, the woman he'd spent 6 months distrusting, questioning, undermining, was a Ranger captain. His face went very still, very quiet. He didn't say a word, just stood there, listening to the radio traffic, while pieces of understanding clicked into place, one after another. The tactical analysis she'd done of the threat reports, the way she moved across the FOB, always checking corners, always keeping her back to walls, the way Barrett had deferred to her, the way Navarro had defended her, the way she'd stabilized casualties with a speed and confidence that went beyond nursing school. She'd been hiding, not from shame, from something else. Something he didn't understand yet, but was beginning to recognize. The Quick Reaction Force arrived 12 minutes later, 2 MH-60M Blackhawks with door gunners. The heavy, rhythmic thump of the rotors announced them before they became visible. The door gunners opened up on the South Approach with M134 miniguns, 6,000 rounds per minute, red tracers arcing through the darkness like lines drawn by an angry god. The attackers broke, scattered, tried to retreat. The ground element from the QRF, a squad of Rangers who'd been staged at Nellis specifically for this kind of response, swept the perimeter and eliminated the remaining hostiles. The firefight ended the way all firefights end, abruptly, with a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise it replaced. Elena stood at her fighting position, rifle still shouldered, scanning for targets. Her ears were ringing. Her shoulders ached from the weight of the body armor she'd grabbed from somewhere. Her hands were steady. Barrett approached from her left, moving carefully, weapon still up. "Clear," he said. "Clear," she confirmed. They held their positions for another 30 seconds, making sure. Because the fight wasn't over until you were absolutely certain it was over, and assuming it was over was how you died in the last 3 seconds of an engagement. Then Elena safed her weapon, slung it across her back, pulled off her gloves, and walked back to the trauma bay. The transition this time was instant, complete. She set down the M4, picked up a suture kit, pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, and went back to being a nurse as if the last 45 minutes had been a dream someone else had. Ethan Price stood in the corner, a tourniquet still in his hand, blood on his scrubs, staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Because he was. "The shrapnel patient needs facial sutures," Elena said, her voice calm, professional, like she was discussing routine post-op care. "Can you handle that, or do you need me?" I can handle it." "Good. I need to check Navarro's circulation and make sure we didn't miss any bleeds. Then we're going to prep everyone for medevac." She worked methodically, checking vitals, adjusting IV rates, making sure wounds were properly packed and bandaged for transport. She moved through the trauma bay with the same focused efficiency she'd moved through the firefight. Compartmentalization, combat brain, medical brain. She could switch between them because she'd been doing it for a decade. Because Kira had taught her how. Because Colonel Dalton had given her the words for it. Holloway emerged from the operating suite, still in her surgical gown, blood to her elbows. "The abdominal trauma's stable," she said. "He's going to make it." "Good," Elena said. "Medevacs inbound, 4 minutes." Holloway looked at her for a long moment. "You held the line." "We all held the line." "No, Captain, you held it. The rest of us supported." Elena didn't argue. She was too tired, and there were still patients who needed her attention. The medevac helicopters landed 3 minutes later. Combat medics offloaded and took report from Elena and Ethan. Casualties were loaded. The birds lifted off, rotors beating the air, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness toward Nellis Air Force Base and the trauma center waiting there. Elena watched them disappear, touched the steel bracelet on her wrist. "We kept them alive, Hawk," she said quietly. "All of them." Behind her, Dalton stood in the doorway of the trauma bay. He didn't say anything, didn't need to, just nodded once, a gesture of respect, of recognition, of pride. The trauma bay was a mess, blood on the floor, equipment scattered, empty IV bags and used medical supplies everywhere. The smell of copper and antiseptic and fear. Elena started cleaning. Ethan helped. They worked in silence, restoring order to chaos, the way medics have done since the beginning of war. "Captain," Ethan said finally, "why didn't you just tell us?" Elena stopped, set down the equipment she was sorting, looked at him. "Because you needed to trust the nurse," she said, "not the rank, not the ranger tab, not the combat experience. You needed to trust the person who showed up every shift and taught you where to put the hemostatic gauze." She paused. "That's who I am, Ethan. The rest is just where I learned it." Ethan's eyes were bright. He looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Elena put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good tonight, really good. You didn't freeze. You trusted your training. You saved lives." She paused. "My friend would have liked you." "Who was your friend?" Elena touched the bracelet on her wrist. "Someone who had good hands. Like you." Then she went back to cleaning, and Ethan went back to helping, and the trauma bay slowly returned to something that looked like normal. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Nevada desert. The sky was turning from black to deep purple to pale blue. The base was securing the perimeter, counting casualties, beginning the long process of reconstruction. And in the Tactical Operations Center, Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hendricks stood alone, staring at a computer screen that showed Elena Thorne's full personnel file. The file he'd never bothered to read. Former United States Army captain, Ranger qualified, 4 deployments, 183 combat patrols, 23 direct fire engagements, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Female Engagement Team, Village Stability Operations, Intelligence Gathering, Operation Ironclad. That last one made him go cold. Operation Ironclad, September 2014. A nighttime raid on a Taliban weapons cache in a compound outside Marja, Afghanistan. Hendricks had led the assault element. The intelligence had been perfect. The compound was exactly where they'd said it would be. The defenses were exactly as predicted. The layout, the guard rotations, the escape routes, all of it mapped with a precision that had saved American lives. 3 of his operators had nearly died that night. The Taliban fighters had been more heavily armed than expected. The firefight had lasted 45 minutes. Hendricks had dragged one of his wounded men to cover, returned fire, called in the QRF, held position until air support arrived. He'd earned his Silver Star for that night, earned his promotion, earned everything that had made him Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hendricks, SEAL Platoon Leader. All of it built on intelligence that Elena Thorne had gathered. 6 months of patient, invisible, dangerous work. Walking through Afghan villages in body armor, sitting cross-legged on dirt floors, drinking tea with terrified women, earning their trust one cup, one smile, one promise at a time. Intelligence work that nobody filmed, nobody celebrated, nobody remembered unless you were the woman who'd done it. He'd built his legend on her groundwork, and he'd spent 6 months calling her the contract nurse. Hendricks closed the file, stood there for a long time, staring at nothing. Then he walked out of the Tactical Operations Center into the rising sun, and he didn't say a word to anyone. The after-action review took place 18 hours later in the Tactical Operations Center. Every operator, every support staff member, every medical person on Forward Operating Base Sentinel was present. The room was packed. Men stood along the walls in their combat uniforms, faces still showing the wear of the previous night. Some had bandages. Some had the 1,000-yard stare that came from surviving something they thought they might not. Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Hendricks sat in the back row. He'd been one of the first SEAL operators to respond to the breach, had spent the firefight on the west side of the compound, engaging hostiles who tried to flank around to the barracks. He'd killed 3 men, saved countless lives, done his job the way he'd been trained to do it for 16 years. But he hadn't known what was happening at the medical facility until he'd heard the radio call. "This is Ghost, Captain Elena Thorne, United States Army, 75th Ranger Regiment." He hadn't said a word since, hadn't slept, had spent the hours between the firefight and the after-action review reading Elena Thorne's full personnel file over and over, trying to reconcile the woman he'd dismissed for 6 months with the warrior who'd held the line. Commander Rachel Holloway stood at the front of the room. She was still in surgical scrubs, hadn't had time to change. She'd spent the entire engagement in the operating suite, trusting Elena to handle everything outside the OR. She'd been right to trust. "Before we begin the tactical debrief," Holloway said, her voice carrying across the crowded room, "I need to address something that became apparent during the engagement." She opened a file. Elena's full contractor personnel file. The one that Aegis Medical Solutions had provided. The one that Holloway had read on day 1 and kept to herself ever since. Our contract trauma nurse, Elena Thorne, coordinated the defense of the medical facility last night. She treated 4 combat casualties under fire. She performed a field cricothyrotomy during the engagement while rounds were impacting the container walls. She coached our junior corpsman through his first combat trauma. And she did all of this while simultaneously engaging enemy combatants with rifle fire alongside Staff Sergeant Barrett. The room was silent, not the polite silence of people listening, the weighted silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew. Holloway continued, her voice steady and professional. "Captain Thorne is a former United States Army officer. She served as a 68W combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. She is Ranger qualified. She conducted over 180 combat patrols in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, between 2017 and 2021. Every face in the room was turned toward Holloway now. Some showed shock, some showed recognition, some showed something that looked like shame. She participated in 23 direct fire engagements. She earned a Bronze Star with Valor for carrying a wounded Ranger 400 meters through an active ambush while suppressing enemy fire with her sidearm. She earned a Purple Heart for shrapnel wounds sustained during a vehicle-borne IED attack. Holloway paused. Let the information settle. Let it sink in. Captain Thorne subsequently served with the Female Engagement Team program, conducting village stability operations and intelligence gathering during her 3rd and 4th deployments to Helmand and Kandahar provinces. Her intelligence work provided target packages for multiple joint special operations missions in the region. Another pause, and then the words that would change everything, including Operation Ironclad. In the back of the room, Hendricks went absolutely still. His hands, resting on his knees, stopped moving. His jaw tightened in a way that only people who knew him well would have noticed. And in this room, everyone knew him well. Operation Ironclad, September 2014. A nighttime raid on a Taliban weapons cache in a compound outside Marja. Hendricks had been a petty officer first class then, leading his first assault element as team leader. The operation had been near perfect. The intelligence had been flawless. The compound was exactly where they'd said it would be. The defenses were exactly as predicted. He'd never asked where the original human intelligence had come from. He'd assumed it was signals intelligence, drone surveillance, the kind of high-tech collection that happened in air-conditioned facilities thousands of miles away. He'd never thought about the quiet work that made the loud work possible. Never thought about the women who walked into Afghan villages and sat on dirt floors and drank tea and earned trust over weeks and months and years. Never thought about the invisible operators who gathered intelligence one conversation at a time, one relationship at a time, risking their lives in ways that didn't involve bullets but were just as dangerous. Never thought about Elena Thorne, who had spent 6 months in 2014 building the relationships that had produced the intelligence that had saved his life and the lives of his teammates and had earned him the Silver Star that had gotten him promoted to senior chief. She'd built the foundation. He'd built his career on it, and he'd spent 6 months treating her like she didn't belong. Holloway was still talking, but Hendricks wasn't hearing the words anymore. He was hearing the radio call from the night before. The absolute calm in Elena's voice as she coordinated fire suppression and medevac in security, managing a complex tactical situation while simultaneously treating casualties and engaging targets. He was seeing her face when he'd questioned her work in front of the entire trauma bay, when he'd demanded his corpsmen double-check her procedures, when he'd told her she didn't need to know the operational details because contractors weren't part of the team. He was remembering Chief Navarro's words from weeks ago. "She's better than half the corpsmen I've trained. She's not the problem." Navarro had known, or suspected, and Hendricks had dismissed it. The briefing continued. Tactical details, casualty reports, damage assessment, recommendations for improved perimeter security. The business of war conducted with professional efficiency by people who did this for a living. Elena sat in the second row. Her face was as blank as it always was. Kira Brennan's memorial bracelet caught the light on her right wrist. She didn't add to Holloway's account, didn't correct or embellish, didn't draw attention to herself. When the briefing ended, she stood up and walked back to the trauma bay to check on the equipment inventory and prepare for the next shift. Like it was just another day. Like nothing had changed. Ethan caught her outside the TOC. "Captain," he said, then stopped, unsure what to say next. Elena looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had during the firefight when his hands were shaking, and she'd told him to look at her instead of the blood. "You can still call me Thorne," she said, "or Elena. Captain makes me feel old." "You saved my life last night," Ethan said. "You kept me from freezing, kept me moving. I wouldn't have made it without you." "Yes, you would have," Elena said. "You had the training, you had the skills. I just reminded you they were there." She paused. "That's what my friend did for me. First time under fire, I completely froze. Forgot everything I'd ever learned. And she grabbed my hands and put them on the wound and said, 'You know this. Do it now.' And I did." "Who was your friend?" Elena touched the bracelet on her wrist. For a moment, she didn't speak, just stood there in the morning sun, remembering. Then she told him, "Kira Brennan, Sergeant, United States Army, my FET partner, my best friend. March 14th, 2021, Kandahar Province. We were on a routine patrol. Dirt road, nothing special. IED buried in the shoulder. 4 of us died instantly, 3 wounded. I was the only one who walked away." Her voice was steady, controlled. The voice of someone who'd told this story before, to therapists and review boards and Kira's mother at the funeral. Kira took the brunt of the blast, lost both legs below the knees. There was nothing I could do, nothing that any amount of training or equipment could fix. And she knew it. I knew it. We both knew it. Ethan was quiet, listening. She was scared, Elena said. I could feel her shaking, but she looked at me and she said, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." And then she said something else, something I've been carrying ever since. She paused. She said, "Keep teaching them, Ghost. That's how I stay alive." The morning air was cool. Somewhere on the base, a helicopter was warming up, the normal sounds of a military installation preparing for another day. "So I teach," Elena said. "Every kid I train, every technique I pass on, every life I save. That's Kira still fighting, still making a difference. That's how she stays alive." Ethan's eyes were bright. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Elena put a hand on his shoulder. "You did good last night, Ethan. Really good. You're going to be an excellent corpsman. Kira would have liked you." She turned and walked back to the trauma bay, leaving Ethan standing there, fundamentally changed by the understanding of what she'd given him. Not just medical training, not just combat skills, but legacy, purpose, a reason to be excellent that went beyond himself. The apology came at 0300 the next night. Elena was in the trauma bay, her usual spot, her usual hour. The patients who'd been stable enough to remain on base were sleeping. The trauma bay was quiet. The south wall had been repaired with fresh HESCO barriers, and the FOB had that peculiar heightened calm that settles over a place that's just survived something terrible. Marcus Hendricks appeared in the doorway. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on the counter in front of Elena, sat down across from her, and didn't speak for a long time. The silence stretched. Outside, the generator hummed. The stars burned over the Nevada desert. Finally, Hendricks spoke. "I lost a guy named Derek Walsh 2 years ago. Different deployment. Contract medic at the forward aid station froze when Walsh came in with a femoral artery bleed. Just stood there, shaking. Walsh bled out on the floor while this guy couldn't remember his training." He stared at his coffee. "I've been carrying that ever since. Carrying the anger. Carrying the guilt that I wasn't there, that I couldn't save him. And I put all of that on you. That wasn't fair." Elena looked at the coffee. Didn't touch it. "I know about Walsh. Navarro told me." Hendricks nodded slowly. "I checked the dates on your deployments. Helmand, 2014, Female Engagement Team. You were the one who developed the target package for Operation Ironclad." Elena was quiet. "You talked to women in villages for 6 months to build that package," Hendricks said. His voice was low, controlled. But there was something underneath it, something that sounded like pain. "You sat on dirt floors, drank tea, earned trust, gathered intelligence that saved American lives." He paused. 3 of my guys are alive because of that raid. 3 men who have wives and kids and futures because you did work that nobody saw and nobody thanked you for." Another pause, longer this time. "I got my Silver Star because of that raid. Got promoted to senior chief. Built my entire career on the foundation you laid." The silence stretched again. Elena still hadn't touched the coffee. "You knew this whole time," Hendricks said. "It wasn't a question." "I'm a nurse, Senior Chief. I pay attention to my patients' records. You came through the trauma bay 3 weeks ago with a training injury. I saw your service record, saw the Silver Star citation, saw the operation name." She paused. "I was there. I knew." Hendricks closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you needed to learn to trust the nurse," Elena said. "Not the rank, not the combat record, not the shared history. You needed to trust the person who showed up every day and did the work." She looked at him directly. "And you needed to learn that lesson on your own. Me telling you wouldn't have changed anything." He nodded, understanding. I want to make this right. Elena finally picked up the coffee, took a sip. It was terrible. The same burnt, bitter mud that every FOB on Earth had been brewing since the beginning of war. But it was warm, and it was offered in good faith, and that mattered. Then trust the next person who doesn't look the part, she said. I almost wasn't here because people like you kept telling me I didn't belong. Don't do that to someone else. Don't make them prove themselves twice as hard just to be seen as half as good. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, left his coffee on the counter, and said something that cost him more than the words suggested. Thank you for saving my guys last night, and thank you for the work you did in Helmand that saved my guys in 2014. I should have said that 6 months ago. Then he walked out, and Elena sat alone in the trauma bay, touching Kira's bracelet, whispering to the empty room. We changed one, Hawk, one at a time. The weeks that followed brought changes to Forward Operating Base Sentinel. Not dramatic changes, not announcements or ceremonies, but quiet, practical shifts in the way things worked. The SEAL operators stopped calling her the contract nurse. They called her Thorn. Some of them, after a few beers in the recreation tent, called her Ghost. She told them to stop. They didn't. Hendricks stopped questioning her decisions, stopped asking his corpsman to double-check her work. When she made recommendations about medical protocols or trauma response, he listened. And when he walked past her in the corridors of the base, he nodded. A small, tight nod. The kind of nod you give to a peer, a warrior recognizing another warrior. It wasn't friendship. It was something older and simpler than that. Respect. One morning, Elena arrived at the trauma bay to find a small Ranger scroll flag hanging on the wall behind her station, the black and gold crest of the 75th Ranger Regiment. She stood there for a full minute just looking at it. Who did this? She asked when Ethan came in for his shift. He shrugged, trying to look innocent, failed completely. Barrett appeared in the doorway, didn't meet her eyes. Thought the place could use some decoration. Elena didn't take it down. Chief Navarro, recovering from surgery in one of the trauma bay beds, watched the whole exchange with a smile. Ghost, he said. That's a good call sign. Suits you. Shut up and let me change your bandage, Elena said, but she was almost smiling. The SEAL operator from Nebraska, the one with the wife and baby daughter, the one Elena had treated for the gunshot wound weeks before the attack, found her in the dining facility one evening. She was eating alone at her usual corner table because 7 months of habit was hard to break even after the world changed. He walked over, set his tray down across from her, sat without asking permission. My daughter had her first birthday last week, he said. My wife sent me a video. She face-planted into the cake, got frosting everywhere. It was perfect. He pulled out his phone, showed Elena the video. A tiny girl with dark curls, grabbing handfuls of cake, smearing it across her face, laughing with pure, uncomplicated joy. Elena watched the video, actually laughed. The sound surprised both of them. She's beautiful, Elena said. She is. The operator put his phone away. I'm going to see her grow up because you kept me from bleeding out 3 weeks ago. And I'm going to see her grow up because you held the line 2 nights ago when those guys tried to breach the medical facility. He paused. Thank you doesn't really cover it, but thank you. 2 more operators brought their trays over. Then Ethan. Then Barrett. By the end of the week, Elena's corner table wasn't a corner table anymore. It was just a table, with people, with something that felt like family. Ethan started calling her Captain again. She had to tell him to stop because it made her feel old. But he'd changed. His hands were steady now. His procedures were confident. He'd started teaching the newer corpsmen the techniques Elena had taught him. She watched him work one night, saw him coaching a fresh corpsman through hemostatic gauze placement, using the exact words she'd used with him. Third shelf, left side. We've been over this. Elena felt something warm in her chest. Pride. Legacy. The knowledge that Kira's teaching had passed through her and was now passing through Ethan to the next generation. This was how they stayed alive, All of them. Kira and the 4 others who died on that dirt road in Kandahar. The knowledge didn't die with them. It moved forward. It saved lives. It mattered. Late at night, when the FOB was quiet and the stars were out and the coffee was cold, Elena would sit in the trauma bay and touch the bracelet on her right wrist and say quietly, "We're okay, Hawk. We're okay." Colonel Garrett Dalton found her there one night, a month after the attack. "Getting late," he said. "You should sleep." "So should you, sir." He smiled, sat down. He looked older in the dim light of the trauma bay. 62 years, and every one of them showing in the lines around his eyes, in the silver in his hair. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. "I came to this base hoping I could pass on what I learned, hoping I could teach one more generation before I was too old to be useful." He paused. "I thought I'd be teaching you. Turns out you didn't need me to teach you. You already knew everything I could have shown you. You just needed someone to see it, to validate it, to tell you that you were exactly as good as you thought you were." Elena was quiet. "That's what I gave you," Dalton said. "Not knowledge. Permission. Permission to be who you already were. You gave me more than that, sir. You gave me the words for it, the framework. You helped me understand what I was doing." "Maybe," he smiled, "but you were doing it before I got here, and you'll keep doing it after I'm gone." "You're leaving?" "Contract's up in 2 weeks. Time for this old Marine to go home. Let the young people handle it." Elena felt something twist in her chest. Not quite grief, not quite fear, something in between. "You taught me a lot, sir." "No," Dalton said gently. "I reminded you of things you already knew. There's a difference." He paused. "I came here hoping to save one more kid. You saved a dozen. That's my son's legacy now. Through you. Through what you pass on to Ethan and the others." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn canvas medic bag, the kind from the 1990s, tan canvas with black webbing, stained with blood and dirt and the residue of 30 years of keeping people alive in combat. "This went to Kafji in 91, he said. "Went to Fallujah in 04 with my son Logan. I want you to have it." "Sir, I can't." "You can. You will." His voice was firm. "Logan didn't get the chance to pass it on. You will. When the time comes, you'll give it to someone who needs it, someone like Ethan. And you'll tell them what I'm telling you now. The knowledge doesn't die. It moves forward. That's how we all stay alive." Elena took the bag. It was heavier than she expected. Not from the weight of the canvas, but from the weight of what it represented. "Thank you, sir. Thank you, Captain, for being exactly who you are, for not hiding it anymore, for showing that kid in there." He nodded toward where Ethan was restocking supplies. "What excellence looks like." Dalton stood, extended his hand. Elena stood and shook it. The handshake of peers, of warriors who'd held different lines in different wars, but had held them the same way. "Semper Fi, Captain." "Semper Fi, Colonel." And then he was gone, and Elena was left holding a medic bag that had been to 2 wars and was about to go to a third, carried by hands that would keep the legacy alive. 6 months later, Elena Thorne stood in the trauma bay at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, training 3 new contract nurses. 2 women, 1 man. All of them experienced, all of them capable, all of them a little uncertain about working at a JSOC training facility where the standards were higher and the consequences were real. She taught them the same way Kira had taught her, the same way Dalton had validated her. Presence over procedure, calm over chaos. The voice that tells someone they're not alone when the world is falling apart. She wore 2 bracelets now, Kira's steel bracelet on her right wrist, and on her left, a paracord bracelet woven in Marine Corps scarlet and gold that Barrett had made for her the night before she'd rotated home the first time. She'd come back after 60 days, signed another contract, stayed, because this was where she belonged. This was where she could do the most good. This was where Kira's legacy lived. Her phone rang during a break in training. Ethan's name on the screen. Ghost, he said when she answered. He was deployed now. SEAL Team 3, somewhere in the Middle East that he couldn't talk about. Had a situation today. Remembered what you said. Look at the wound, not at the chaos. Saved a guy's life. Elena smiled. That's not me, Ethan. That's Kira. She's the one who taught me. You're carrying her forward now, too. Tell her thank you. I will, she hung up. Looked at the three new nurses watching her. Saw in their faces the same uncertainty she'd felt 7 months ago when she'd first arrived. The same doubt about whether they belonged, whether they were good enough. Let me tell you something about this job, she said. You're going to doubt yourself. You're going to wonder if you're ready. You're going to have moments where everything you know disappears, and all that's left is fear. The three nurses listened. That's normal. That's human. The difference between freezing and functioning isn't whether you're scared. It's whether you know what to do when you're scared. And that's what I'm here to teach you. She picked up Dalton's medic bag, set it on the table. This bag went to the Gulf War in '91. It went to Fallujah in '04. It's going wherever you go next. Not because it's magic, because it represents something. It represents the knowledge that doesn't die, the legacy that moves forward, the idea that we keep each other alive by teaching each other how to stay alive. She looked at each of them in turn. You belong here. You're good enough. And I'm going to prove it to you the same way someone proved it to me. By showing you that you already know this. You just need someone to remind you. Training continued. The weeks passed. Elena taught. The new nurses learned. The base ran its cycles of training and deployment and rotation. The great machine of American military power grinding forward the way it had for decades and would for decades more. And late at night, when the base was quiet and the stars were out, Elena would sometimes drive out to the edge of the installation where the desert stretched away into darkness. She'd sit on the hood of her truck and look up at the sky and talk to Kira. I'm keeping the promise, Hawk. I'm teaching them, all of them. Ethan's deployed now, saved a life today. That's you, still making a difference, still saving people. The wind would blow across the empty spaces. The stars would burn overhead, the same stars that burned over Kandahar and Helmand and every other place where Americans had fought and bled and died. I'm not invisible anymore, Elena would say, and neither are you. On a cold morning in November, Elena took leave and flew to Washington, D.C., rented a car, drove to Arlington National Cemetery, walked through the rows of white headstones until she found the one she was looking for. S.G.T. Kira Brennan, USA, 1997 to 2021. Beloved daughter, sister, soldier. Elena knelt in the grass, placed Barrett's paracord bracelet on the headstone. The scarlet and gold looked bright against the white marble. I kept my promise, she said quietly. I kept teaching them. Ethan's saving lives now. 3 new nurses are learning. The knowledge is moving forward. You're still alive, Hawk. In every kid I teach, in every life they save, you're still fighting. She touched the steel bracelet on her wrist, the one she'd worn for 6 years and would wear for the rest of her life. I'm not the invisible woman anymore. I'm not hiding. I'm teaching. I'm passing it on. That's how we all stay alive. 100 meters away, another grave, another white headstone. Captain Logan Dalton, USMC, 1980 to 2004. Semper Fidelis. Elena walked to it, knelt again. Your father taught me what you never got to teach your Marines, she said. He gave me his medic bag, told me to pass it on when the time was right. I'm doing that now, training the next generation. Your legacy isn't just him anymore. It's me. It's Ethan. It's all of us. She stood, looked at both graves. 2 warriors who died too young. 2 legacies that refused to die with them. Thank you, she said to both of them. To all of them. To every person who'd taught her something and then trusted her to pass it on. Thank you for making me better, for making all of us better. She walked back through the rows of headstones, past names she didn't know, past wars she hadn't fought, past the accumulated grief and sacrifice in honor of a nation that had been sending its children to war for 2.5 centuries. At the gate she turned, stood at attention, saluted. Then she got in her car and drove back to the airport and flew back to Nevada and reported for her shift at Forward Operating Base Sentinel exactly on time. Because there were people who needed teaching, and wounds that needed healing, and a legacy that needed carrying forward. The fire doesn't care what branch you served. It doesn't care if they see you or not. It doesn't care about your rank or your medals or your gender or your background. It just asks one question: what kind of person are you? And the answer lives in your hands when they're steady and the world is shaking. It lives in your voice when someone needs to hear that they're not alone. It lives in the knowledge you pass on, and the lives you save, and the legacy you carry forward. That's what Kira Brennan taught Elena Thorne. That's what Elena Thorne taught Ethan Price. That's what Ethan Price would teach the next generation. And that's how they all stayed alive. Not in memory, not in grief, but in the hands of every medic and corpsman and nurse who learned the lessons and passed them on and kept the knowledge moving forward into whatever wars were coming next. The invisible operators, the ones who saved lives in the shadows, the ones who did the work that nobody saw until the moment everyone needed them. They were never really invisible. You just had to know how to see them. And once you learned to see them, you realized they'd been there all along, holding the line, keeping people alive, teaching the next generation, one pair of hands at a time, one life at a time, one promise kept at a time. That's how the story ends. And that's how it begins again, every single day. In trauma bays and field hospitals and forward operating bases all over the world, the invisible warriors, the ones who knew that the most important battle wasn't the one you fought with weapons. It was the one you fought with knowledge, with teaching, with making sure the next person was better than you were. That was the battle Elena Thorne had been fighting since the day Kira Brennan died in her arms. And it was the battle she would keep fighting until the day she couldn't anymore. Because that's what warriors do. They hold the line. They pass on the knowledge. They keep the legacy alive. They stay invisible until the moment they're needed. And then they save the world. Back at Forward Operating Base Sentinel, as the Nevada sun set over the desert, Elena Thorne walked into the trauma bay for another night shift. On her right wrist, Kira Brennan's steel bracelet caught the light. On her left, Garrett Dalton's paracord in marine scarlet and gold. On the wall, the Ranger scroll that Cole Barrett had hung. And at the table, Ethan Price teaching a new corpsman where to put the hemostatic gauze. Third shelf, left side. Elena smiled. The legacy was alive. And the invisible warriors were right where they'd always been, holding the line,